Okay, thanks a lot, Perry. So I'm going to talk to you about the ultimate cosmetic blacklist. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the founder of Cosmetic, which is a new business that I created about 6 months ago. And the main aim is cosmetic training and consulting. But it is actually more than that, because what I would like to do is for Cosmetic Chroma to really be your go-to place for all things technical in the cosmetic industry. And my background, in fact, I was Regulatory Affairs Global Director and also Head of Quality at 2 companies here in Italy. One was Dolce & Gabbana, and the other one was Intercos, which is a third-party manufacturer. I equally worked for about 12 years at L'Oreal in the UK and also in Paris. And I have a PhD in inorganic chemistry with 15 publications, and equally qualified as a chartered chemist for the Royal Society of Chemistry in the UK. So the start line, so Perry, would you mind launching the poll?
Yes, I can do that. All right, the question and the poll should be showing up on your screen right now. What's your goal to gain from understanding this webinar? So feel free to post that and we'll see. There you are. Okay.
Yes, that. So it's about feeling reassured, a lot of reassurance that I can see there, which is great. Okay, we will cover all of this today, and you will see how you can get your dream of feeling reassured. So my goal for you today is essentially to share with you my professional experience so that you can create a blacklist from scratch, or you can make improvements to your existing blacklist to make it into the ultimate blacklist. And why are both of these important? Well, firstly, it's to reduce any of your product development risks. And these may include financial, reputational, regulatory, but also the media. So why am I the right person to speak to you about blacklist? Well, I was actually responsible for chemicals management at Walgreens Boots Alliance. This was when I was working in Nottingham. And as well as being responsible for that, a few of my tasks were to actually do the cosmetic ingredient monitoring and also to anticipate the regulations, as well as develop strategies for particular ingredients. I will go into this a little bit more in detail. Equally, I was in charge of global regulatory at Intercos, a third-party manufacturer here in Italy. And in fact, I compiled the most extensive blacklist you can imagine, all by hand. You have no idea how many hours I spent on this, but it was well worth it. I looked at probably close to about 500 ingredients and developed company positions for each one of them, together with the reason why I had developed that company position. And you will see that you can create a company position, but what I think is important and why it becomes an ultimate blacklist is the motivation for creating the company position. And that is the key point and what we're going to go through today. Okay, so today, what will you learn? So today we will have a look at what exactly is an ingredient blacklist and who can issue such a blacklist. We will also look at why they're important, both internally within various companies, as well as within the government authorities. We will equally glance an eye over the purpose of a blacklist overall. And really the key point, which I'm sure will ally most of your concerns about having credible information, is how to create a blacklist. Where do you start? And also, how do you keep your blacklist updated once you actually have one? So let's begin with the introduction. So what exactly is an ingredient blacklist? Well, a blacklist refers to a list of banned or restricted ingredients. and these are generally established on the basis of a set of criteria. When you think about a company blacklist, these blacklists are not there to just tell you what the regulations are, because you can just seek out the regulatory text on the relevant government websites. But in fact, a blacklist, the key point is that it goes above and beyond the regulations, and we will see how this is possible. And equally, your company blacklist is a place, your one go-to place, which reflects your own company positions and policies with regard to individual ingredients, or it could refer to groups of ingredients, or it could refer actually to a legislation. So who can issue an ingredient blacklist? Well, generally speaking, I'm sure you're aware that many brands create their own blacklists and or companies, but equally, you may not know that retailers create their own blacklists as well. So for example, if you are a brand and you want to sell in a retailer, examples are Target, Whole Foods, Boots in the UK, Mariano, Sephora in France. They all have their own restrictions with regard to ingredients. So you need to be mindful of what retailers are actually putting in their blacklist before you start formulating or developing your product. Equally, third-party manufacturers often have a blacklist. In fact, at Intercos, I developed their ultimate blacklist. And equally, of course, you're aware, government authorities, they don't call them blacklists, but they call them ingredient lists, restricted lists, banned lists, positive lists, or other types of lists. Okay, so what is the importance of a blacklist? Well, let's look at it from the point of an internal company, but also a government authority. So for an internal company, for example, there may be some new and or updated safety information that becomes available. And normally when you think about the EU regulations, but perhaps also other countries around the world, it takes a little bit of time for any ingredient to be updated or added into the regulations. And therefore, there's nowhere to capture this information on safety. So you can use your blacklist to capture this information. And in fact, with this information, you can potentially predict what the regulation might be. Note that safety information and opinions are not legislation, but they are very useful for this prediction of what a regulation could be for the product. Equally, as I mentioned before, you can put your company policies and or strategies into your blacklist. This could refer to your policy on sustainability, and I mean in terms of ingredients. So, for example, palm oil. You could decide to be a member of the RSPO, which is the Round Table for Sustainable Palm Oil, and so on. There are other policies that you can have in relation to sustainability. Equally, there may be particular ingredients that have environmental concerns. And the example that I wanted to state was about microplastics. So microbeads were banned quite a while ago, but microplastics is a recent development within the chemical legislation of the EU. Then we also have clean concepts, but equally now we're also moving towards the movement of green and probably more green chemistry as well. Then we also have consumer perception, media and NGOs. And why on earth do you think that I have put this in this slide? Well, I'm going to explain more about this in the following slides. And then also you can capture any of the latest cosmetic industry trends. And I will explain more a little bit as well. Okay, so for our ingredient government list, essentially the European regulation, but many cosmetic regulations around the world are founded on one key principle, which is human health and safety. So the government is there to ensure that no harmful chemicals are used in cosmetic products, and all those some need to be restricted as well. Now, equally, having a list of restricted or banned ingredients helps the regulatory authorities ensure compliance and also market access. Because I'm sure you're aware that when you want to sell a cosmetic product onto the market, global markets, you have to supply the ingredient list. And in some markets, in many markets, in fact, you have to supply also percentages of those ingredients. So the authorities can check that you are adhering to the legal requirements. Then we also have environmental legislation. And the angle for the creation of environmental legislation is, as you guess, to protect the environment. And the example of this I mentioned already is ECHA, which is the European Chemical Agency. And they've designed a legislation called REACH. And also, with regard to government lists, it also builds and fosters consumer trust. So the consumer knows that when they pick a cosmetic product off the shelf, in general, they expect it not to harm them. So the purpose of a blacklist, in my view, is your go-to place for all your ingredient positions and all the ingredients that are hot topics, if you like, within the industry. And generally speaking, you need to keep your blacklist up to date because there are a lot of evolutions within the industry, particularly in relation to ingredients. So again, it not only fosters trust and transparency vis-a-vis consumers, it also fosters trust and transparency within your organization, particularly if you're trying to explain to marketing or to sales, to marketing that you can't use a certain ingredient, or to sales why your products are blocked. So that would also build trust and credibility for you if you are able to explain that to them. Okay, the key question is how on earth do you create a blacklist? Some of you may have come into the cosmetic industry and are already working for a cosmetic company, and there probably is already something in place. However, some of you might be startups, a little bit like myself, and you want to know where to start. So this is for you, but also for those people who would like to take your blacklist to the next level. And why? So that you can gain this credibility as well as increase your influence inside and outside the organization. So the first thing you need to do with a blacklist is clearly you need to select ingredients. So you have to decide, what ingredients do I put in my blacklist? Where on earth do I start with these? And once you've chosen your ingredients, you actually then need to decide what is your company position with regard to those ingredients. Now, when you have 10 ingredients, well, okay, it might sound simple, but you have to choose 10 out of 10,000 ingredients. So where on earth do you start with this process? And you start, first of all, in my view, with the drivers of ingredient restrictions. And what do I mean by that? Well, you are aware, obviously, that ingredients have been restricted through the legislation. This is the common baseline that everybody is aware of. The problem is that nowadays there's a greater trend for other factors to enter into the restriction of an ingredient. And we'll go into these in much more detail. So that would include consumer perception, the way in which a consumer perceives an ingredient, and also the cosmetic industry trends, but also the companies themselves and what are they doing. Okay, so let's have a look now at the drivers of these restrictions. So, as I mentioned, the drivers are absolutely key because they actually identify the motivation for your position. So if you have to justify that you have banned an ingredient or you have restricted it unnecessarily, according to sales and marketing, for example, you need to be able to justify why you've done that. And if you're able to justify that, you will get, as one says, brownie points. In other words, you will start to build your credibility within the organization. And equally, not just internally, but if you are have ever been in contact a direct contact with authorities, the government, for example. When you're trying to place your products on the market, or you have an inspection. I think an inspection is probably the most terrifying because you are basically there justifying everything. And if you're able to do this with your blacklist, I think this is a key point. Particularly, for example, in the press, there was an example, they did a survey of heavy metals that were present in the various makeup products on the market. And the newspaper published this article. And then what happened was the authorities got hold of this article and they went and contacted all the various companies asking for justification for the presence of certain heavy metals in their products. And you are allowed to have trace amounts, but you also have to justify the levels that you have in your products. And you can use a blacklist to help you know what are the limits. So what I've done is I've created by my creative mind is to start off, you need to think about all the ingredients that could possibly be restricted. Now, legislative is relatively clear. However, there may be cases where you go above and beyond the regulations, and we will have a look at this. You would then need to be aware of what the consumer is doing and what they are perceiving. And in the course, I go into a lot more detail on this because obviously I only have 40 minutes to explain all of this to you, which is a very complicated topic. But it's their perception of free-from claims. It's their perception on what is cruelty-free. And also, does the innovation that's being offered to me, does it connect with my values? And you can see more the drive of vegan, green, sustainability, and so on. Then we have trends as well. So these are the cosmetic industry trends linked to clean beauty. And clean concepts like, for example, I want to have a very small ingredient list. I want to source ingredients locally rather than sourcing them from abroad. I want to use more natural ingredients. Then we have logos and standards, and then various sustainability concepts. And then with regard to companies themselves, we talked a little bit about this, and this is where we're looking at retailers themselves having their own blacklist. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit more onto the legislative drivers. So as I've mentioned, the main legislative driver is human health. And under human health, you have two areas of consideration. And the fundamental one is safety. And then after that, you have the regulatory, which essentially summarizes the safety. Now, in the European Union, some of you may be aware that the European Commission has, within its remit, a committee called the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety. And what happens is the European Commission may get a wind of something or become aware of certain dangers with particular ingredients. And they will then send a mandate to the SCCS, or in other words, they just ask them to say, can you tell me whether this ingredient X is safe for use at 1% in leave-on products? And the SCCS will go away and look at all the safety studies and so on, and they will then come back with an opinion. Now remember, a safety opinion from this organization, whilst it is part of the European Commission, it is not a law, it's not a legislation, but it certainly can give you a good idea of what the European Commission are looking at, and you can then see if potentially it could be a legislation or not. The US has a similar system with the Cosmetic Ingredient Review, and they also have the generally recognized as safe GRAS standard. So after all of that, the information is then put into the regulatory annexes. So as I'm sure you know, we have the banned list, the restricted list, and 3 positive lists, which are some filters, colorants for the products themselves, and preservatives. And in the US, we have prohibited and restricted ingredients and a lot of rules surrounding colorants. In Canada, for example, we have the hot list, and in China, we have the IECIC, which is the inventory of existing ingredients, chemicals. Now, the key to all of this, obviously, is that you need to have a regulatory and safety monitoring put in place in your organization. Or you need to contract this activity out to an organization who can follow this for you. Now, the other legislative driver is very important, and I think it gets lost in translation with the cosmetic regulation founded on human health. But the thing is, when we look at the EU and we look at the European Chemicals Agency, they have set up a system called REACH, called the Registration, Evaluation and Authorization of Chemicals. Now, this area for environment are not restricted to cosmetic ingredients. They cover all of the ingredients or chemicals within their member state. So China have adopted a similar version to the EU, and then Canada and Australia have some kind of positive list in a way, because they want to know what substances, chemical substances, are actually in their country. Canada has the domestic substances list, as well as the non-domestic substances list. And in Australia, you also have NICNAS and the Therapeutic Goods Association. Now, basically, when you think about Canada and Australia, you have to check if your ingredient is present on one of these lists. Otherwise, you have to add it to the list. And in that case, it takes absolutely ages. So we also have some specific environmental legislation, in particular to the US and Canada, but there are others. The USA and Canada have a rule about volatile organic compounds. So they have a list of all the compounds, and they have the levels that they will accept. And then the famous Prop 65, which is California law for the drinking water. And I will show you an example of this a little bit later on. Okay, so now let's look at consumer perception and trends and what this has to do with being a driver of restrictions for cosmetic ingredients. Well, the problem is, it's not always a problem, but a lot of consumers are becoming much more ingredient savvy, should I say. They're following a lot of information that is put on social media. And of course, social media, you don't really know which is the truth and which is not the truth. Equally, you have the media who likes to also do a bit of scaremongering. We also have NGOs, and we also have the birth of apps like Yucca app, which I think was born in Germany. And the problem with all of this information, there's so much information out there that consumers in some ways don't really know where to turn. They make assumptions and they also take things out of context. I'll give you an example of this when we think about sodium hydroxide. Now, sodium hydroxide, you know, is an alkali and is a hazard. It's obvious. However, we use sodium hydroxide in our cosmetic formulations to neutralize the pH, so to bring the pH, to make it more acid, as it were. And at the end of the pH being changed, there is no longer any sodium hydroxide, theoretically, because it's been used up to lower the pH. So therefore, by law, you do not need to add this to an ingredient list. However, when I was working at Dolce & Gabbana, there was an example of a third-party manufacturer we use who actually added it to the ingredient list. And I didn't put it on the artwork, and mainly also because it's by law, it's not needed. And secondly, of course, it's because of consumer perception. If a consumer sees that there's a cosmetic product labeled with sodium hydroxide, you can see the opportunity for a blown up press story. and a lot of social media going crazy about it. So in this case, we always have to consider the hazard versus the risk. So it's a strong hazard, but there's a minimal risk. There's no risk almost with this alkali being present in there. And this is what I mean about consumer perception, because it's all taken out of context. Now, you also need to think about your company positions, not only just to ingredients themselves, but equally other aspects of trends, if you like. So if we look at a clean policy, what exactly is a clean policy? How do I create one? Well, you can start off by thinking about animal-derived ingredients. Do you want to allow animal-derived ingredients in your product, like honey, beeswax, and so on, lanolin? So you have to think about various factors. You say, okay, well, yes, okay, it's allowed, or is it allowed? I would like to use it, but what is the general trend at the moment? Is it going away from animal-derived ingredients, or is it moving towards them? And you have to make your own decision that's right for your company. We also have cruelty-free. If you're going to claim cruelty-free with the use of a logo or just the words themselves, you have to be able to prove it. So how far are you willing to go to prove it? Are you going to use the leaping bunny, which is, I would say, the gold standard? Are you going to use a better logo? Are you going to use your own logo? And equally with logos and standards, like, for example, organic. Are you going to use Cosmos to prove that your product is organic, or are you going to use ISO standard? And lastly, I mentioned before sustainability. It's thinking about palm oil. Is it obtained in a sustainable way? Are you going to join the RSPO? What about mica? Are you going to make sure that it's mined in the sustainable way and there's no harm towards the workers that are working in the mines for mica? So yeah, so you need to consider all the different angles, not just the regulatory. Now, companies I've already mentioned, basically, it is a good idea when you are thinking about monitoring, is that you actually do try to find out what other company and retailers are doing in terms of their positions with regard to certain ingredients. The other way to find out more about which ingredients are banned by other companies is to join trade industry association working groups within the cosmetic industry. And equally, there are also some IT tools that you can use as well. The story isn't over yet. That's just half of the story. So now we actually need to get into the nitty-gritty and go down a level. And we need to start choosing our ingredients and our company position. Okay, I'm sure a lot of these ingredients are very familiar to all of you. I've put these into categories. So we have functional ingredients that perform the function of the product, obviously. We have aesthetic ingredients that support the functional ingredients. And also we have other ingredients, maybe marketing want to put some vitamins in there. Maybe there's some added proteins or some plant and botanical origin. And maybe they want to create stories about some of the ingredients. If the marketing does decide to create a story, that's fine, but you have to be careful with active ingredients. If they perform an actual function in the product, that they are efficacious, and you have to prove that they are efficacious at the level that you've added into the finished product. So functional ingredients, surfactants, moisturizers, inorganic pigments, organic colorants. We've also got film formers, the actives and also reactives when you're thinking about hair dyes and perms. Aesthetic ingredients would be the solvents you use, the adjusters like the pH I mentioned, preservatives, thickeners, rheology modifiers, fragrances, fillers, special effects, and also delivery systems like nanosomes, and the other ingredients that you can also add to your product. So I think that the first point of call is really to start looking at these particular ingredients that are used in your products. And then you can then start to narrow it down by looking at the drivers. So you can, for example, if you are choosing, let me go back, if you're deciding to focus on the category of surfactants, and you want to know which surfactants you need to put, or if you need to put surfactants in your blacklist. Well, you would obviously need a list of your of surfactants, which is available on the internet or raw material suppliers. And you could then consider, are there any restrictions with regard to surfactants? You can also see if there's any consumer perception with regard to that particular ingredient. You can pretend you're a consumer, join the Yucca app, for example, go on social media, and you can see which ingredients tend to pop up. Trends as well, considering the trends. So as we're moving to more green, it's likely that animal ingredients will be used less and less. And then retailers, you need to ensure that when you're creating your blacklist, that you need to align with your retailers, because there's nothing worse than trying to get your product into a retailer at the last minute when it's been done and finding out that they've got an ingredient that is in your product and you cannot sell in that retailer. So let's have an example of this, because it's a complicated topic and not so easy to get one's head around it. So I mentioned the example of surfactants. So you can break this down into further categories, subcategories. And, we have anionics, cationics, amphoterics, and non-ionics. I've listed some of them. They're obviously not a comprehensive list, but you get the idea of the types of ingredients that might be in there. You could decide, for example, to keep it as a category. So rather than list individual ingredients, which would take a long time, potentially, you could decide, I'm going to take a position on sulfosuccinate in general. If you feel that that is too broad and you want to still keep some lauryl sulfate salts in that particular category, you could decide just to focus on sodium lauryl sulfate. So the next thing is, as I mentioned, you then go and look at the legislative driver, the consumer perception drivers, the trends, the media, and so on and so forth. And what I've done, just like magic, is come up with SLS, sodium lauryl sulfate, does have an irritation potential. And that, I would say, would be a safety point. And then also, it is in media. So there is a media risk of using sodium lauryl sulfate because the consumer is aware of it. So this is the type of work that needs to be done for your blacklist. And so on and so forth with all of the different subcategories of surfactants. For example, when we're looking at cationic quaternary ammoniums, there has been some indication of contact and systemic toxicity as well as aquatic. If it's aquatic, it could become on the environmental list, and systemic is obviously due to human health. Amphoterics, you can go crazy with those because they have a good safety and environmental profile. Non-ionics, be mindful of the amines because they can release nitrosamines into the environment. So some of these may or may not be regulated already. And the question is, do you follow the regulation? If so, nothing to say on your blacklist. Or if you prefer, you can add an additional restriction. Okay, let's look at some other examples to show you what I mean as well. D4, D5, and D6. So these are the cyclosiloxanes, and they came about in about year 2017, and the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, they emitted officially a restriction proposal for law. And they want to restrict these cyclosiloxanes to less than 0.1 and leave one. Then they decided to also add a D6 to 0.1 and rinse off. Then they decided to also add D5 to the same percentage and rinse off at a later date. Now, the problem is, as a chemist and someone in marketing, cyclohexyloxanes give a really nice texture and feel to the product, particularly for a foundation. So it was actually quite disappointing, even for me, to see that they had some concerns on an environmental perspective. So what's the situation? What do you do as a company? You know that there's been this restriction proposal. Well, the first thing is when you're deciding your company position and it's a legislative concern, you need to ask yourself, what is the risk of this becoming a legislation? Is it a medium, is it a low, or is it a high risk of it becoming a legislation? If you decide that it's high risk, then of course you're going to need to take a company position on this. However, you need to decide, am I going to just ban it outright? Or am I going to just stick to the legislation of 0.1? And that's a question you have to take internally. Equally, you need to know when you decide to take this position, because you need to bear in mind the time for product development for a straightforward product is only 18 months. So are you going to say that, okay, no new product development will, if you decide to ban it, will have these ingredients in 18 months out before the supposed legislation? And therefore, if you decide to ban it, you have to have alternatives. And this is the key point. So you need a strategy to deal with this situation. So it's not just deciding your position, that's the first step. But the second step is actually, what are you going to do internally with your products that are on the market and that are in the development phase? Parabens. I know it's an old story, but it is highly relevant because it applies to in other cases as well. Parabens are actually allowed, methyl and ethyl parabens are actually allowed in Annex 5, as well as butyl and propyl parabens. Now, of course, they're restricted. However, a consumer perception. Now, in fact, how did the consumers end up seeing parabens as the bad guy? Well, in fact, it was some small companies who decided to say free from parabens on their packaging and the formulation. Consumers started to see this more and more, and then they thought, oh, okay, it's free from parabens. What does that mean? So parabens are bad? Why are they saying free from? Why do I care if it's free from? And in the end, it became such a story that consumers actually globally decided that parabens are actually seen as bad. But the thing is, the legislation says that you can use some of them. So your question as a company then, okay, what do I do then? Do I ban all parabens? I don't really want to ban parabens because they're an effective preservative. Or do I say, okay, I'll follow the legislation and allow those, but I won't allow any others? You know, what exactly will be your position in this case? And once you've decided your position, you will then have to probably release a press statement on certain hot topic ingredients. CITES is quite a hot topic, endangered species. It's a legislation you may not have heard of, but basically when you are doing cross-border trade, so going across into different countries, there is this CITES law which aims to protect endangered species, so animals and plants. There are some exemptions, like, for example, if you're doing it for research, if you've had the specimens before the legislation came into being, and if being bred in captivity and artificially propagated in terms of plants. So let's look at the different drivers on this law. So the legislation is clearly there to protect the endangered species. Consumer perception is obviously ethical considerations. You don't really want to be seen as the company that is using species that are endangered. And then also you've got the trends, as you know, with the concerns around the planet, global warming, and the sustainability concepts. So therefore, as a company, what do you decide? Do you decide to follow just the legislation and say, okay, we will allow exceptions? Or do you say, okay, well, with regard to this legislation, I'm not going to allow anything, even exemptions in this case. So this is a good example of how you can make a decision based on a legislation which can go into your blacklist. Now, Prop 65, I'm sure many of you have heard this, California legislation. Prop 65 is actually a Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act. And the objective is to protect the drinking water from contamination of chemicals that are known to cause cancer, birth defects, and reproductive harm. In other words, CMRs. So they have a list of about 900 chemicals, and all of them have thresholds. Well, in fact, not all of them, but let's say for our argument that they do. And if you use an ingredient on the list and it's above the threshold in the legislation, you have to put a warning on the artwork to say, warning, this product causes cancer. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that. And there are a lot of lawsuits to do with this legislation, and a lot of rich lawyers are making a lot of money from it. And also, companies can file it, but equally individuals can file it. So this is the danger with this legislation. So if you look at the other drivers like legislation, consumer perception, and the trends, what about the consumer? Do they understand that if you allow an ingredient below the threshold and you don't have to put the warning, is it still okay? Will the consumer still think it's still okay? And this is where consumers things can get out of context. And they say, well, that's a harmful chemical you put in your product. But you say, yes, but I've justified it from a safety point of view, and it's below the threshold on the legislation, and it's safe. But the consumer just starts panicking, and emotion takes over. And in the end, well, you think, okay, I think we better not use it anymore. And equally, clean beauty goes exactly in this direction, because you obviously want the drinking water to be clean as well as your product. So what's your company position? Will you use it at all, even if it's below the threshold and considered safe? Will you just say, okay, I'll use it for California and the US potentially, but for other markets, I'll use it below the threshold if it's considered safe? What will be your position? So again, this is another example of the type of things that you need to think about with regard to creating your company position. Right. Obviously, this is a very complicated topic, and I go into a lot more detail in the course. So keeping your blacklist updated, well, this is challenging. And as I said before, the main thing is really to set up an internal monitoring system. As I've mentioned, there are various ways of doing this. You can follow directly on government websites. You can go through the trade industry associations. You can subscribe to the magazines. You can subscribe to some consumer and industry insights. I've seen quite a few of them where you pay a vast fortune for a report and they will give you everything going on. Sustainability, you need to be aware overall is the trend within the industry on that. And also logo requirements, because to get a logo on your artwork, it's great, it looks lovely, but you have to be able to substantiate the logo. So you have to know what the requirements are for all the different logos. And it can get extremely complicated with regard to the logos. And then, of course, you've got the environmental concerns. You've got the political agendas that are going on. So, like, for example, in the EU, they want, with this Green Deal, they want to have zero pollution by the end of, I think it was 2035 or 45, I'm not sure. But it's become highly political. And there's a lot of ingredients in Europe that might become banned just automatically because of hazard. So once you've also set up this process for monitoring, you also need to define an internal process for communication and issuing of updated blacklists. And you need to be sure that you're solid in your motivation for your company position, so that you can explain it to marketing and or sales or whoever else in the business needs to know about it. Okay, your ultimate blacklist should look something like this. I've only chosen 2 of them. So as you can see on Proposition 65, in this particular case, the company decided to ban and to follow the restrictions noted in the Prop 65. And why? Well, it was a health reason because they're considered in California as carcinogenic and or toxic. And regulatory-wise, it's legislation compliance. Now, CITES, in this case, the company decided to restrict, so only exempt and derogated species are allowed. There is an annex in the legislation. And from a regulatory point of view, you'd need documents, permits, and certificates for the border crossing of certain species. And the media, obviously, there's a risk because of the respect for the environment and endangered species. And in fact, fashion companies have a big problem with this because, of course, they're using leather, not just from cows, but from exotic animals. So I have come across this when I was working in a fashion company. So now this is the point we've reached where you can find out more information. The course itself is called Regulatory and Scientific Landscape of Cosmetic Ingredients. It's one that I wrote myself. Just to bear in mind that there's 3 modules of this course, and these are also found in the overall regulatory course. So if you've already bought the other course, then, well, you don't need to buy this because it's included. So why should you do this course? Well, it depends on you and what you're looking for. It does help you anticipate better and will give you the chance to reduce costs in reformulating and minimize any business risk. Equally, if you are the lonely formulator doing your formulations, knowing company blacklist and knowing why those ingredients have been chosen will actually help you anticipate for other ingredients that may be proposed by suppliers. And then you can have a seat at the table, as it were. It increases credibility when discussing with authorities and also internally. And as I mentioned, improves your decision-making when you're formulating and or creating your product briefs. And you'll be able to create really effective blacklists. So the course is split into 3 parts, as I mentioned. The first part really focuses on the drivers, which I think are absolutely key. I go into a lot of depth into each of these drivers, and you get to learn exactly how it pieces together with the blacklist. Then the second part, so that you can create a blacklist, is also thinking about ingredients and categories that you use in formulations. As I said before, functional ingredients, aesthetic, other ingredients. And you can add your list of ingredients under each of these categories and then drill down until you get to the category or the individual ingredient that you would like to have a position on. And then lastly, I talk about the general key ingredient categories which are on the legislative landscape, and each of these that are listed here are high-risk ingredient categories. So for example, microplastics, endocrine disruptors, big news on endocrine disruptors coming, I'm sure of it. CMRs, also big news. And fragrance allergens are a big hot topic. Now you have to label something like 82 of them. Nanomaterials, hot topic, as is heavy metals. Okay, benefits for you. Well, I've written a course and you can email me directly if you have any questions during the course. I think my cosmetic industry experience is quite unique compared to others. I've worked with all global markets. I've worked with big internationals, but also kind of startups as well. Worked for a retailer and I've worked for third-party manufacturers. So it's quite a broad experience, and I would definitely say unique. I also, in the courses, you can test your knowledge with a quiz. I think that's quite standard. So you have 3 quizzes for this course, and you get a certificate upon completion. And again, if you're under pressure with work, family commitments, whatever, no time limit, your pace, your time. If you take 10 years, that's up to you. If you take 1 month, that's also up to you. It doesn't matter. It's available for you for life. So thank you very much. If you would like to email me, you can see my email here.
And if you want to contact Karen directly, it's Karen at cosmeticchroma.com.